Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about section 5.5, particularly prions. So what the heck is a prion? List the characteristics that describe a prion and how they are different from other infectious agents. So remember, we're talking about acellular pathogens, so these are not cellular. And it turns out prions aren't even so they're not cells, but they aren't even as complicated as viruses. They are simply proteins. Only protein. Remember, even the virus capsid had protein subunits. So the prion itself is just like one single protein molecule. So how do we know about prions? Well, for hundreds of years, there have been a disease that's been documented called scrapie. And you can see here's a sheep with scrapie. It's a disease of sheep, and the sheep just aren't mentally normal. This is really typical of a sheep with scrapie, where they're going to rub their bodies against a tree or a fence or whatever repeatedly, and they're actually going to wear their wool off. And a scientist in the 1980s was studying this disease and didn't find a bacteria causing it, didn't find a virus causing it, and ultimately found this protein that he ended up calling a prion. And the prion kind of is a shorthand name for proteinaceous infectious particles, or easier to say is a prion. So when prions infect an organism, what are the signs and symptoms of prion disease? Well, in your lecture study guide, I have the term spongiform encephalopathy, and you can also call it transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. So transmissible is going to be, it can be transferred, it's contagious, can be transferred from one organism to another. Spongiform, spongy, encephal brain, pathy disease. So prions, every organism that gets every prion disease causes a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, spongy brain disease. Now, lots of different organisms get prion diseases. Humans do, cows, sheep. There's one in mink. There's some in elk and deer. That being said, prion diseases are not common. You may very well go your entire life and never be aware of an animal or a person who gets a prion disease. These are very uncommon. But this might look familiar if you ever took A&P and looked at some slides under the microscope. And there's a neuron right there. This is some brain tissue. There's a neuron cell body. See that? The extensions coming off there. And here's some neuron cell bodies. But what is not normal in here are these spaces. Brains are not supposed to have spaces in them. They're supposed to be filled with gray matter and white matter and no big spaces like that. And that's the spongy brain disease that's developing because of these prions. And what you can see here, there's a disease in humans that we're going to talk about in just a minute called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And it's telling you here, it's rare. It's not something, again, you might ever see. But here's a section of a normal human brain. And here's one with a patient that had Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD. And you can see it's much more shrunken. The spaces in the brain are much larger. So the brain is really deteriorating. Any organism, any animal that gets a prion disease is going to suffer confusion, memory loss, personality changes, uncoordinated movements, and ultimately fatal. There's no prion disease that's survivable. And most of these, the animal will not live more than a year or so. So how do prions infect host cells? I want to let you know, in your textbook, in your ebook, there's at the beginning of section 5.5, there's a little video, and it shows you what I'm going to be talking about right here. So I highly recommend watching that. It's only like a minute and a half or something. But so if prions are just proteins, and we know we need our genetic material, all cells need genetic material, DNA or RNA, to give the instructions on how to make the next generation of cells. So how can a protein copy itself without DNA or RNA? And this is a really simple version of that story. It's getting more and more complicated as people learn more about this. But there turns out that there are certain kind of proteins in everybody's brain, every animal's brain, that are very similar to prions. And they call it this endogenous prion protein. There's a protein that everybody has that's needed for normal function. So there's that normal protein. Here is this spiky one. We're going to call this the prion protein. So maybe it's from, scrapie from the sheep. That's the pathogen causing the disease. So if this pathogen, if this prion is able, this abnormal prion is able to get access to the brain tissue, what it does is it meets up with normal prion proteins in the brain. And it actually kind of refolds them and makes them look like the pathogenic prion. And those prions will accumulate in the brain and cause that spongiform encephalopathy. You can think of it like zombies. Like we've got these normal brain cells or normal proteins in our brain cells. And these abnormal proteins come on in and they're the zombie. They get the healthy cells and they change them into zombies. So you get these accumulation of these abnormal proteins, and that causes the pathology of prion diseases. So they're all diseases related to the nervous system. So how the heck do you get one? Again, remember, these are not common. So this is a table that I don't think it's in your book, but it's something that's useful. They're showing you this one disease. If you talk about prion diseases in humans, the most common one, which is still extremely rare, is called Creutzfeldt-Jakob. I say Jacob, it's Jakob because it's German. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And there's different versions of this CJD. The familial version is inherited. And there's about 200 cases per year in the US. And it says the age of onset is about 68, where this brain deterioration starts. People usually die within months. And it's not just in the US, it's found at that rate throughout the world. So it's a genetic disease, and you can inherit it. But fortunately, it's not a very common gene, so only 200 cases a year in the US. There's another form, so how do you acquire it? Well, you might inherit it. The other one, this one, ICJD, can come from the environment. And here it says it's from contaminated neurosurgical instruments, corneal grafts, contaminated gonadotropic hormone, and possibly blood transfusion of somebody who's infected with a prion disease. This was discovered when somebody, like a surgeon, was transferring. There's been a couple of cases. There was a case where there was a patient that died of a neurological disease, and they took the corneas from that patient and transplanted them to another patient, and that patient got a prion disease. They got CJD. And so apparently the prions can accumulate in the corneas. It's also happened to surgeons who are doing surgery, and they cut themselves when they're doing brain surgery on a patient with a prion disease, and they cut themselves and introduce prions into their own blood. So it's not necessarily going to happen from getting blood from a blood bank, but you could get it through like a wound, delivering it directly into the wound like that. There's one called Kuru, and there was in the 1950s, there was a group that was studied that was eating, had ritualistic cannibalism. What they did was when somebody died, it was an honor to actually eat their brains. So certain family members got the privilege of eating some brain tissue of somebody who died. And what they found out is people were getting Kuru. And Kuru was a prion disease, the typical neurodegenerative disease. And when sociologists went in and figured that out, they stopped doing the ritualistic cannibalism and the disease stopped. So you can get it that way. Fortunately, again, that's very uncommon. There's another prion disease that's a genetic called fatal familial insomnia, which you can't go to sleep. It's genetic and you can't fall asleep and you eventually die, and it's caused by a prion. So I'm going to come to this one in the next video, but there's a prion disease that you've heard of probably called mad cow disease, and I want to talk about that in the next video, but it's called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, or mad cow disease. And that, the only record of that, it was first observed in 1986. There was no record of that before that. It started off in the UK. It peaked in 1993. There were a lot of protections put in to prevent these cows from spreading this disease, but it was determined to be a prion disease. So how did the cows get mad cow disease, BSE? Well, it turns out that this is explain the relationship between CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and BSE. So we knew there were sheep that had scrapie. This disease has been documented for a long time. And what the practice was, like now that we've gone to these big factory farms, you might have thousands of animals on the farm. If you have sheep or you have cows or chickens or whatever it is, an animal's going to die periodically. And so what people were doing on these big farms is if they had a sheep that died, they would just, what do? You take all this time and bury it? Well, no, sheep have a lot of protein in them. So they would just take the sheep and they'd throw it into the hopper and they'd grind it up with the feed they were feeding the cattle. So cows occasionally were exposed to tissue from dead sheep, and they ate it. And so what was determined was when cows ate tissue from sheep with scrapie, they had the risk of getting mad cow disease, or BSE. And so sheep fed to healthy cows could transfer a prion, and when the cow got the disease, we called it BSE, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. What then happened is there was this mad cow disease outbreak going on, and in the UK, and they were trying to get a handle on it. But what they noticed after a while, after a few years, is there was also a spike in CJD, the prion disease in humans. And we know that this is, like we said, it's a genetic disease. There's usually, or another obvious reason why someone would get one, but there's never been like a spike in the number of CJD disease cases. And so what scientists figured out is sometimes when people ate beef from cows with mad cow disease, they developed a prion disease we now call variant CJD. So if we look back on the previous table, we said to get CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, it's either a genetic disease or you get it introduced into your tissue with cornea transplants or a wound from brain tissue going into your blood. But now this variant CJD you could get from eating contaminated cattle products. And in that case, people died within 14 months. There were a total of 177 cases by the end of this epidemic between 1995 and 2014. And you can see that it's a little bit different than this familial CJD, because here, this is where people died within months, but they were older. They started about at 68. With this variant CJD, we noticed that people were younger when they got it, and they didn't die quite as quickly, which might have been because they were younger. But once the mad cow disease epidemic got under control, and the main way they did that is by destroying cattle, but also eliminating the practice of feeding animals to the cattle. So you no longer are allowed to do this in farming practices. You're not allowed to feed dead sheep to cows anymore. And we've had no cases of CJD or variant CJD. And that's it.